So I'm going to do an orphan train video. I think the orphan trains are very important to understanding what's going on right now. So the U.S. government sent out this memo saying they don't want their employees to take any more of these DNA tests. They said the reason is privacy. The reason, I think, is because of all these other articles you can see of people getting their reports back to heritages and things that they didn't expect. So people have been taking these tests and waking up. People have been realizing they're not who they said they were. Their heritages, their backgrounds, their family stories, their bloodlines. It doesn't line up to what they've been told. Their nationalities aren't lining up. Okay, so people have been figuring that out. Then the U.S. government sends out the memo saying they don't want their employees to take it anymore, banning all employees to take DNA tests. I think they're trying to cover up the orphan trains. Everybody's DNA tests have been coming back to orphans, and people are figuring it out. That's why their heritages aren't lining up. Our ancestors were all orphans. And I'm going to show you some footage to kind of scratch the surface. I'm not going to try to remake footage that's already made. I'm just going to use this great footage from these other channels. And I'll put links to the channels in the description. Well, this is kind of like an orphan train mashup. Here's John Levi.
And here I was just watching something that was shared with me featuring Jerry Seinfeld, and it had to do with the Coney Island infant incubators. And the interviewer asks him about his history, and he says his father was an incubator baby. And the interviewer laughs as if he doesn't believe him. And I'm going to play that for you.
Early 1900s, my dad was an incubator baby.
And very strange. Of course, we've talked about this before, but in short, between 1854 and 1929, the relocating of about 200,000 orphaned, abandoned, abused, or homeless children took place. And a very sad story, something in between acting as if they're doing a noble thing for these children and at the same time benefiting the needs for labor, for farmers, and even for the railroads. Here they're showing us advertisements placed in papers encouraging the adoption of children. Here we can see a poster. A number of children brought from New York are still without homes. Please call and see them. And often they were treated like farm animals. Their teeth were inspected. They were made to do push-ups and other tests of fitness. This program originally said to be started by this man, Charles Loring Brace, and we're told in the 1850s there was up to 30,000 homeless children in New York City, and New York City's population at the time was 500,000. And this guy has this great idea to start shipping them across the country. In this early time period, some cities barely even getting started, barely laying the tracks to these supposed newly constructed cities. We're told these children were often known as street Arabs. Brace believed that street children would have better lives if they left the poverty of New York City and were instead raised by morally upright farm families. And in short, these children were ultimately slaves, not sold for the love and care of a new family, but rather for their ability to labor. And I think this whole story is a lot more twisted than this simple and seemingly well-intended narrative. The children were told, your parents are not your parents. Your life begins when you are chosen.
Do either of you have any sense of how far back your ancestries go in New York? Have you ever?
Yeah, I mean, mine came in the 1920s from Ireland, Northern Ireland.
Mine about the same, early 1900s. My dad was an incubator baby in Coney Island. He was on display. They had just invented the incubator. It was.
You could literally tell me anything, I believe.
No, it's true.
Yeah.
In the 1800s, the railroads faced a problem. Farm labor shortages along their newly expanded westward lines threatened profitability. Not surprisingly, in 1853, they jumped at the chance to support a New York City minister's idea, an early version of foster care that would find homes for the city's orphans on farms in the Midwest.
They were told, your parents are not your parents, your past is not your past, your life begins when you are chosen. The Orphan Trains began because a Methodist minister in New York City named Charles Loring Brace looked around the streets of New York and saw that there were 30,000 children living on the streets. They were getting run over, dying of starvation and exposure, going to jail, becoming criminals, they were becoming prostitutes. What we think of as Dickensian London is really what it was like then for poor people. Immigrants were pouring in, the Industrial Revolution was replacing jobs for poor people with machines, the Civil War was raging and creating vulnerable war widows. So there are many reasons that there were all these children on the streets. And Brace had this idea, it was sort of a glorified fresh air fund. He thought, if I can get children off the streets and send them to farms in the Midwest where labor is needed, maybe we can save their lives, and maybe we can clean up the streets of New York. He worked with the train companies to send children on trains to the Midwest, and the trains each held between 10 and 30 children. And over the course of the next 75 years, over 250,000 children were sent to the Midwest. There were two ways that people got children from the orphan trains. The Foundling Hospital, which got into the act a little bit later, would put notices in newspapers around the Midwest, and people would write in and say, I'd like a blonde, curly-haired, blue-eyed, 7-year-old boy with a sweet disposition. And so they would look around and find that child and put him on a train, and then that person would be waiting on the other end. The Children's Aid Society had the children line up by height at a train platform or at a city hall or a Grange hall. Then farmers or whoever came would often, not unlike a slave auction, have them run in place, check their teeth, check their muscles, have them do even sit-ups or push-ups to make sure they were strong because they wanted workers. The farmers would take them off the stage and then fill out certificates taking ownership of the child. Contracts were signed between the people who took the train riders in and the organization, the Children's Aid Society or the Foundling Hospital, and it says, shall be indentured until the age of 21. These children were 2 to 14 years old. 21 is quite a long time to be working for someone else. The people who took in the train riders were required to send them to school, 4 months of schooling a year, to feed and clothe them. There was some language about treating them as you would one of your own. However, they were labor. For some of them, it was actually a form of slavery. Many of them had no choice but do what they were told to do. There were volunteers in communities who were supposed to check in on the children. That was rather spotty as a process. For one thing, they were volunteers. And because children were property, even if someone went out to check on a situation, it was much more likely that the adults would be believed than that the child would be believed. Furthermore, there was a great disincentive to take children out of homes because it was so hard then to know what to do with them. And so they would often leave children in situations that were not really the best for them. It was an imperfect system, and what it meant is that it was absolutely a roulette wheel. And the children had no choice about where they were going, and the people who took in the train riders were as varied as human nature. There were very good people, very kind people who took in train riders, and there were also people who weren't so good and kind. Even if the people who took them in were kind, they often treated them as a little bit less than family. One of the reasons we don't know much, that most people don't know much about the orphan trains, is that the train riders themselves didn't realize that they were part of this large movement. 250,000 children go on these trains, and most of them think that their train was the only one that went. So you can see why they didn't organize more quickly or reach out to each other. I was so lucky. When I began this book, there were 150 living train riders. Today, there are probably between 10 and 20. It was such a gift. I had access to living train riders and could interview them. One of the most significant was a woman named Pat Thiassen. Even at the age of 93, she felt the loss and the sort of sorrow. She said, "They were good people, but they were not my people." As one train rider said to me, we had been through so much turmoil and so much trauma. Every child who rode the orphan train had been through something terrible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been there because the trains were the last resort.
You have not resubscribed to Martin's channel. Here it is. And he was sharing a historical narrative of the evacuees of Britain during World War II, especially children. Now, we have talked about orphans introducing waves of populations to these city centers that seem to be abandoned. And where do all these orphans come from? And where do all of the populations come from? And here in this Philip Druzinin video called Survival Locations and From Where Did the Replacement People Come From, Philip was sharing the idea that perhaps it was a breeding program. And I've mentioned in the past that the World's Fair photos that we've looked at appear to be the introduction of a population, very possibly coming from the inside of these buildings or underground. And I won't dismiss a breeding program. Even in some of our oldest stories, such as the Bible and the Sumerian texts, we see breeding. And God taking a rib from Adam and creating Eve, and really seeming like a metaphor for something more scientific as we would understand today. And I don't know, as always. I'm only asking some questions. And today, between Martin and Philip, we'll consider breeding and also relocating. The evacuation of civilians in Britain during the Second World War was designed to protect people, especially children, from the risk associated with aerial bombing of cities. Operation Pied Piper. And now, if you remember the story of Pied Piper, the story of this man luring children out of a town with a flute. Originally, he was commissioned to lure the rats out of the town, and when he was not paid his full sum, he used his same magic to lure the children out of the town. And so much wisdom encoded in these old fables. And are they really fables? Seeming to date back to the 1300s, according to the narrative. But going back to this evacuation, and originally they'd estimated they would move 80% of the children, and they were only able to move half of all school-age children due to the refusal of central government to spend large sums on preparation, which reduced the effectiveness of the plan. Regardless, over 3 million people were evacuated. 3 million people. I mean, what a mess, and who would willingly agree to this? Having their children pulled out of their arms? I would just assume families would escape a government that would impose such a suggestion. But no, they tell us 3 million people were moved, and here's a little look. Child evacuees from Bristol arriving at Brent in 1940. And just really seeming to have a good old time. Not seeming like they have been yanked from their families. Seeming like they are arriving somewhere. But I don't know. And here's the Merchants Hill School. It was an evacuation camp in 1944. So here's where a lot of these children ended up. Really interesting. And it looks like they're still awaiting their meals. Maybe they're up here on the table. And very unpleasant seeming situation. And furthermore, evacuation centers were also set up by the Foster Parent Plan for Children Affected by War, later renamed Plan International. One American school was sponsored by the FPP, with each child being financially supported by an American citizen. The Children Overseas Reception Board approved 24,000 children for evacuation overseas. So here you go, now beginning to ship overseas. 1,500 children were evacuated to Canada, some to Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. So here you go. Here is the introduction to a population, populating all of these places that really don't fit the narrative, and where do these people come from, and here it is. Just one example. This is just one little example of creating a situation, the fear, and then the solution. Well, here is the solution. But really, this is just the story. And I don't think that the story would be as we're told. But nevertheless, a sliver of the truth, at the very least, being in this story. The Second Evacuation started during and after the fall of France in 1940. Around 100,000 children were evacuated. Goods as well as people were evacuated. Organizations or departments departed the city. Art treasures were sent to distant storage. The Bank of England moved to the small town of Overton, Hampshire, and they moved over 2,000 tons of gold to the vaults of the Bank of Canada in Ottawa. So here they move 2,000 tons of gold to Canada, along with children. So that's when I jumped over to this next page and wanted to have a little look at the timeline of Ottawa history. And really, according to them, dating back to 1610. But when we read all of this, really just seeming like a big joke, and I'm not going to get into it, but pretty ridiculous. And here with a population in 1881 of 25,000, 1912, the Union Station opens, and now we find ourselves back to this 1916 Victoria Tower, burned down, and this was very important in the mid-1800s. 1859 to 1866 once again. And so here you go, a little 25,000 person town needing to build something like this. Completely ridiculous. And did they move 2,500 tons of gold to this city, or inherit much more? And simply needing to populate this city and seizing children from other countries in the name of war and protection. And here you have a little look at the occupants at the base of this castle. Here you go. Less than a dozen people for this monstrosity. One horse, little buggy. And this is just absolutely mind-blowing and completely ridiculous. And, it just gets me to think about the settling. And whether it's relocating or whether it's breeding. Either way, with relocating, shortly thereafter, you have breeding. So either way, you need to move a small group to an area. And you only need to convince this first group of the story. And if they're children, well, they'll believe anything. And then all future generations are on board. Actually, very simple to create a history, a false history. And one of my favorite examples of the possible settling of an area post-reset is the Salt Lake City story about the Mormons and Utah. The first permanent settlement to date, marked by the arrival of the Mormons, was in July of 1847. 1847, 4 days after arriving, they began construction of this temple, and this one, and this tabernacle. 4 days after arriving to the valley. So they arrive in 1847, a handful of people, mostly men, some women and children. And in 1890, 40 years later, this is a little glimpse of what they have created in 40 years. Said to have trekked across the country with oxen and wagon, and in 40 years, a complete build-out of the city. Really remarkable and unbelievable. Trolley cars, and really, besides wearing suits, a very primitive people, seeming to be walking around a futuristic city, considering their needs at this time. And here's another little look in 1912. And if you've been to Salt Lake City, it doesn't look much different. And in 1890, I'm sure it looked exactly like this. These are not buildings that you just throw up in a few years. And this city is clearly much older.
The image of the Victorian child chimney sweep is indelibly romantic and makes most people think of Mary Poppins. But the truth is, chimney sweep kids usually led lives that were, to quote the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. New chimneys in the Victorian era had very narrow winding structures, which meant that small children were the only humans that could fit through them. The horrors of child labor were many, and the repercussions for the children who were chimney sweeps were nothing short of dire. It's generally believed that the earliest chimneys started to appear in Britain around 1200 CE. Prior to that, most structures were just one room, and if necessary, they would have a fire burning in the center. The earliest chimneys were large and wide, but their design continued to evolve over the next several centuries. It actually wasn't until after the Great Fire of London in 1666, when new safety regulations required narrower, more angular flues, that people started to use small boys to climb into their chimneys and clean them. As the age of industrialization set in, the number of buildings with chimneys exploded, and the services of child chimney sweeps came into high demand. Dangers of chimney sweeping were well known, and as a result, there were few people willing to accept the risks the job entailed. However, the chimney had to be swept, so someone was going to have to get creative. Unscrupulous taskmasters eventually figured out they could get around the problem by buying orphans from the local parish, or purchasing poor children from their poverty-stricken parents. Yeah, you heard that right. They bought kids from their families. Diabolical. These families were generally saddled with too many mouths to feed and probably had few options when it came to surviving. How much did a child cost? Prices generally ranged from 7 shillings to 4 guineas, and the ideal age for a child to start training was considered to be 6. Such transactions were typically a one-time deal, and it wasn't really a great deal for the young one either. They would receive no pay for their work, and although they were technically considered apprentices, for all intents and purposes, they were really just young slaves. These deals then bound the new sweepers to their new master until adulthood. The bulk of a chimney sweep's job was to shimmy up the flue with a large brush over their head. The flues were incredibly narrow, so the boys usually did their jobs sans clothing. As they moved through the flue, they would knock loose soot to the ground, where it would be collected later. The soot could be resold by the master at a profit. The master sweep did have some responsibilities under the law. He was supposed to teach the sweepers the craft, feed them, give them clothes, shelter, and allow them to attend church, among some other things. But how well these responsibilities were enforced is anyone's guess. After a 7-year apprenticeship, the sweep could graduate to journeyman, and eventually they could go work for a master of their choice. That is, if they were lucky enough to live that long. A Victorian child chimney sweep's working conditions were beyond awful, and it would be truly shocking to even modern coal miners. The children would typically be given a blanket designed for collecting debris while they worked. And something that sounds like it's ripped right from Charles Dickens' mind, this filthy debris collector would usually double as bedding for the child at night. This being the case, asthma and other breathing ailments were common, as were sores and other inflammations on the eyelids. Moreover, the job would almost always stunt the chimney sweep's growth. This is because the work required the sweepers to remain crouched in unnatural positions inside the tight chimneys. This would damage their growing bones and joints. A later study would show that the knees and ankles were the most heavily affected areas. And if that's not bad enough, the actual work of cleaning the chimney was nothing short of utterly terrifying. The inside of the flues were always pitch black. The chimneys were incredibly claustrophobic, and they were often confusing to navigate on account of the dark. And we're not done yet, because the most nightmarish part of the whole thing was that even if the chimney sweep successfully wriggled into the narrow portal they were required to clean, there was no guarantee they would be able to get out. The chimneys were often built in rows along the sides of buildings, and their flues often merged. A chimney sweep who climbed the whole chimney to the roof could easily go back down the wrong one, or go down the right one, but then make a wrong turn at an interconnected point in the flues. Chimney sweeps who entered the wrong chimneys or got lost in the flues could suffocate or even burn to death. Anyone claustrophobic yet? Oh, okay, good. I'm not the only one. Know that most were no more than 18 inches wide, and many were slimmer. They were also often twisted, and many young chimney sweeps got fatally lost inside the dark and winding chimney structures. The child chimney sweeps, who could sometimes be as young as 4 years old, were typically at the mercy of their brutal and cold-hearted masters. How cold-hearted were they? Well, they were so cold-hearted that it wasn't uncommon for them to literally light a fire beneath the child to encourage them to climb more quickly. This sadistic practice is a thing of the past. But if you've ever discussed motivating another person by lighting a fire under them, this is what the metaphor refers to. And you are a sadistic master, metaphorically. If a sweep did get stuck in the chimney, the standard operating procedure was to either let him perish or send a second sweeper in to attempt a rescue. These rescues often didn't work out, and in such cases, both sweepers would be lost. The walls of the house would then have to be torn down so they could be removed, all to clean a chimney. Chimney sweep's job wasn't already the worst. In 1775, Dr. Percival Pott observed that men who worked as chimney sweeps had an abnormally high rate of scrotal carcinoma. In layman's terms, sweeping chimneys gives men testicular cancer. The good doctor was kind enough to describe the progression of what he called chimney sweeper's cancer in a fair amount of detail. To begin with, Pott states that the disease makes its first appearance on the inferior part of the scrotum, where it produces a painful, ragged, ill-looking sore. This unpleasant-sounding condition was known in the chimney sweep trade as sootwort. Pott observed that a growth would only develop in men over the age of puberty, which he noted led to its frequent misidentification as an STD. He also noted that the disease worked fast, writing that in no great length of time it penetrates the skin and seizes the testicle, and when it arrives at the abdomen, it affects some of the viscera and becomes painfully destructive. It wasn't Captain Obvious, but Pott's research also led him to conclude that the chimney sweeps had a tough life. He wrote that in their early infancy, they are most frequently treated with great brutality, and they are almost starved with hunger and cold. They are then thrust up narrow and sometimes hot chimneys where they are bruised, burned, and almost suffocated. And when these sweepers did get to puberty, they would become liable to a most noisome, painful, and fatal disease. Because of the invasive nature of the condition, few of the people who contracted the disease would live past middle age. The disease, thought to be caused by coal tar containing arsenic, had the dubious distinction of being the first ever reported occupational cancer. As for those who didn't contract it, they would usually develop lung cancer later on, since chimney sweeps inhaled countless toxic substances. The grim bottom line was, some form of cancer was basically inevitable and unavoidable for chimney sweeps. It's tempting to think that people in the past did shocking things because they didn't know any better, or they just didn't consider whatever it was to be shocking back then. But even in its heyday, the practice of using kid chimney sweeps was met with criticism. A bill calling for regulation of the trade was passed in 1788. But as is often the case with such measures, it was rarely enforced. A man named George Smart invented a mechanical chimney sweeper in 1803. And while you'd think all the child deaths would have people celebrating at such an invention, the machine was generally ignored. An improved sweeping machine was introduced in 1828 by an anti-child labor campaigner named Joseph Glass. The simple yet ingenious device consisted of cane rods connected by brass screw joints. The final product was a flexible wand that was capable of navigating the complex flues. The device, which Glass didn't even attempt to patent, was approved by the government, and in 1829, Robert Peel ordered it to be used in all government buildings. Various other attempts to curtail child labor practices were made over the decades that followed, but they were all largely unsuccessful at reining in the practice until the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834. This law, which was partially premised on the testimony of Joseph Glass, prohibited the taskmasters from taking on any boys under the age of 14. Yeah, that's still pretty young. And no, the bill really didn't do anything to lessen the suffering of these slightly older boys or of any chimney sweeps at all, really. But we're grading on a curve for these people. Finally, in 1840, the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act made it outright illegal for anyone under 21 to work as a chimney sweep. That's when this atrocious practice finally heard its death knell. Just kidding. Everyone ignored the law, and it was business as usual for another 35 years. In 1875, a 12-year-old chimney sweep named George Brewster got stuck in a chimney and perished. His boss was subsequently found guilty of manslaughter, and widespread publicity over the incident led to a fervent campaign for even stricter regulations. After this, the sweeps were finally protected by a bill that was aggressively enforced. It was too late to save the lives of the countless young laborers who had already succumbed, but at the very least, no kid would ever again be forced into a chimney to line some slave driver's pockets.
Chim, chimney, chim, chimney, chim, chim, chiree. A sweep is as lucky can be. Chim chimney, chim chiroo. Good luck, we're a both when I shake hands with you. Oh, blow me a kiss, and that's lucky too. Now as the ladder of life has been strung, you might think a sweet on the bottommost rung. No, I spends me time in the ashes and smoke. In this all wide world, there's no happier bloke. Chim chimney, chim chiroo. A sweet bitch as lucky can be. Chim chimney, chim chiroo. Good luck, we're a both when I shake hands with you. Chim chimney, chim chiroo. A sweet bitch as lucky can be. Chim chimney, chim chiroo. Good luck, we're a both when I shake hands with you. I choose me bristles with pride, yes I do. A broom for the shop and a brush for the flu.
Oh, it's awfully dark and gloomy up there.
There now, you see how wrong people be? That there is what you might call a doorway to a place of enchantment. Up where the smoke is all billowed and curled, between pavement and stars is the chimney sweet world. When there's hardly no day, nor hardly no night, there's things off in shadow and halfway in light. On the rooftops of London, cool, what a sight.
Chim chimney, chim chiree. When you're with a sweet, you're in glad company.
Nowhere is there a more happier crew
And them what sings chim chiree, chim chiroo. Chim chimney, chim chiree, chim chiroo.
So, in my research, I started doing my Mudflood research, and I came across that building. I looked up the Oddfellows because it said it on the building. Come to find out, the Oddfellows are a group of Freemasons. The building was made in 1907, and one of their main jobs was to educate the orphan. So I think that the building I found in my last Mudflood video is an orphan school to teach the orphans. It also shows the Freemasons educating the orphans right with the globe, right from the beginning. So my point of this video is they brought the orphans and they indoctrinated them using the Freemasons right from the beginning, using the globe. So this whole world, the new world that they reset and started over, was started by the Freemasons. The orphans were indoctrinated and taught by the Freemasons. And they brainwashed the children using the globe. So that's why everybody believes in the globe so much now. Because they based the new world teaching the orphans the globe.